Welcome to Matt's Corner of Gem Cutting. Recently, a company called FABLE sent me one of their faceting machines. I will be going through the parts of the machine and setup, and then demonstrate how I facet a stone using both of the faceting hands that come with the machine. FABLE has a few variations of their faceting machine, including a more expensive version that has an automated height adjustment platform. The model that I am using is this FJM 2014A with the manually adjusted platform. The only difference between it and the base model next to it is that it has this auto run switch for the grinding wheel instead of just the foot pedal for operation. Straight from the box, there is the mast with the platform for the faceting hands to sit on and adjust the height while faceting. This is the water drip tank and the post that it attaches to. This is FABLE's main faceting handpiece. And there is a more simple octagonal handpiece. Accessories include the 45-degree angle adapter for fastening the table. There is a wrench, pliers, and this special tool that tightens a large nut for the grinding discs. Here are the bolts and Allen wrenches for attaching the mast and post for the drip tank. Back here is a set of dop sticks with a holder for them. This big red brick is wax for dopping. There are a couple dopping work tables. This is a 10 times loop with some measuring tools. Here is the power supply cord. Up front are the 400, 800, and 1200 grit grinding laps and a zinc alloy polishing lap that also doubles as a master lap. And over here is the splash guard. Now this machine runs on two 20-volt outlets and we have one 10-volt outlets in America. So I purchased a power converter box that is not included with the machine to be able to run the machine here. Here's the machine's base. The first switch turns on the power. The second is the automatic run switch. And down here is the foot control pedal. This ring is the water catch pan, and up here is the nut for holding the grinding discs. I'm just going to flip this up so that we can see what is going on within the base. There is a fan and motor assembly. This plastic hose pulls out. It attaches to the bottom of the catch pan, and the other side will go into a drain bucket for catching the water that is used during faceting. Now to set up the faceting machine, I place the base of the machine at my workspace and position it where I want it. The base should sit level, so I checked that. My old floor is slightly slanted, but I have leveled my desk and the machine looks to be sitting pretty level on it. Attaching the mast, there are 3 bolt holes that look like any of them can be used for attaching the mast to have it positioned a little more in or out from the grinding wheel. I position the mast over the center hole, which will keep the other 2 covered. The larger bolt and Allen wrench are used to attach the mast. I hand screw the bolt in as far as I can and then finish tightening it with the wrench until it is tight and the mast feels well secured to the base. The post for the water drip tank goes over the bolt hole located at the back of the machine near the catch pan. I use the drip tank to help me determine which direction the post should be. I settled on having the post out further from the catch pan as I liked where that positioned the drip tank better. The smaller bolt and Allen wrench are used for attaching the drip tank post. The drip tank slides onto the post and can be locked in place by hand tightening the lock screw. The splash guard just slides right into the inside of the catch pan and sits in there. The drain hose is routed out the back of the machine. I use an old milk jug with a hole cut in the lid for the drain hose to insert. I place that under my desk. The power supply cord is attached to its slot in the back of the machine. The other end is plugged into the 220-volt socket on my power converter box, which will be plugged into a wall socket and turned on. I untangle the foot pedal and place it at a convenient spot at my feet for use. I turn the power on to check if things are working. The fan comes right on with the power button and runs the whole time that the machine is on. It helps keep the motor cool. I test using the foot pedal. It seems to work just fine. Next is to test the auto run feature. It doesn't run continuously. It goes for about 7 seconds and then stops for about 2 seconds before going again and repeating the cycle. Everything is working, so I turn the machine off and bring in the rest of the accessories, setting them up for easy access for when they will be needed during faceting. The first demonstration will be done using FABLE's faceting handpiece. The handpiece just sits on top of the platform. There is a bubble level to show if the handpiece is sitting level on the platform. The handpiece has 3 legs on it that can be adjusted to get it level. Once leveled, the larger nuts can be tightened to hold the leg bolts at the set positions. I hold the bolt to keep it from twisting when tightening the nut. The quill is the part that holds the dop stick. It has a twist nut to lock the dop in the quill. Back behind that is the protractor, which is used for setting the cutting angle. This round piece is the index gear and is used for setting the rotation of the stone. The gear is double-sided. One side is notched as a 96 index gear and the other side is a 64 index gear. It is on the 96 index side and I want to switch to the 64 index, so using the Allen wrench that fits the bolt, I take that out to turn the index wheel to the other side. This quill assembly is spring-loaded, so I have to hold the quill in while turning the index wheel over, or else the spring pushes the quill out the front while the bolt is not attached, holding it in. The index wheel is rotated by pushing the quill in towards the body of the handpiece, which allows the wheel to spin freely. After rotating to the desired index notch, releasing the quill will lock it in place. The angle is set by loosening the twist knob on the protractor, adjusting it to the desired angle, and tightening the twist knob again to lock it in place. The platform is also held by a twist knob. Loosening it allows the platform to be adjusted down or up to get it to the height needed for faceting. It can also twist around the mast post for positioning where I want the platform and handpiece to be. There are 3 of these lock tabs on the second mast post that are used to save the height that the platform was set to, so that I can easily return to the same mast height when going back over the facets cut at that spot. The tab sits just up against the inner lower edge of the platform. When switching between the saved height adjustments, the second post can rotate to move the tabs out of the way for moving the platform. I am just about ready to get started faceting a stone. Looking at the set of 10 included dops, they are all the exact same, so I just grab one of them to use. The stone that I will be faceting while demonstrating the first handpiece is this lab ruby. It is a used piece from jewelry. It has a bit of wear and can use a new cut. I'll dop the stone using the wax that came with the machine. The wax is warmed until it is softened and becomes workable, and I get enough of it onto the end of the dop stick for working. When dopping with wax, the dop, wax, and stone all have to be warmed to get a good bond. If the wax is attached to a cold stone, it is likely that the stone will pop off easily when faceting it, but if everything is warm and cools together, the bond is a lot stronger. I work the stone centering it by eye, not being too concerned about it being perfectly centered, as it is a lab gemstone. It doesn't take the wax very long to cool before it is ready to be worked, so I will get the first cutting lap put on. The nut for holding the laps tightens counterclockwise and loosens clockwise. This is opposite of all the other lock nuts on the machine and opposite of what I am used to. The thick white plastic washer comes off with the nut and goes between it and the laps. Taking out the zinc lap, I put that down first, as that will act as a master lap base for the thin topper cutting laps so that they don't bend or warp while faceting. I place on the 400 grit lap to first use. The plastic washer and nut go back on, twisting the nut counterclockwise to tighten it. This special wrench fits the holes in the nut to get it a little tighter than hand tight. I filled the drip tank with water and adjust it to where it is in a good position for dripping water on the inner portion of the grinding lap. This little lever is used for opening the water drip valve and adjusting how fast the water is dripping. The dop with the stone is ready to go into the quill, so I place the dop all the way in until it stops and tighten the lock until it is good and tight. I don't want the stone rotating in the quill while faceting from it coming loose. The facet design that I am using for this stone is FVS 56. It is a design by Fred W. Van Sant and was found on facetdiagrams.org. I'll demonstrate faceting this stone the way I normally facet, which is pavilion first, meet point faceting. I am just going to roughen the new cut a little bit at the 400 grit level. I adjust the angle to 41 degrees for the facets that form the center point. I lower the platform until the stone is just touching the lap to start out. I set the drip speed to where I want it. I turn on the machine and I make sure I am set on one of the indices for the facets I am going to be doing. To grind using the handpiece, it is set on the platform with the front slightly raised and then lowered to touch the lap for grinding. Since I adjusted the platform to where the stone was just barely touching the lap, it isn't going to grind in very far before hitting the hard stop. The hard stop with the handpiece is when the front leg is down solid on the lap, keeping the stone from lowering any further. I can hear and feel when the grinding is slowing down from it reaching that stop. So I go until it hits that stop and do that for 4 facets around the stone to check how close the facets are to making a center point. The center point doesn't have to be perfect yet, as this is the general rough in. I'll be more precise when I switch to the 800 grit. These facets are in far enough, so I go on to roughing in the other facets that make up the center point at 41 degrees. There are 3 sets of facets that are very close to 41 degrees that meet at the center point. On the diagram it was sets 4, 5, and 7. And since they are all cut at the same angle and meet at the center point, their height isn't changed between the tiers at all, so I can cut all 3 of those sets at the same height. When I finish roughing those in, I use one of the tabs to save the platform height. I am not going to be doing all of the facets at the 400 grit level, but I will rough in the larger set of girdle facets as well to get the general size and shape close before moving on to the next grit. I found that the splash guard got in the way for fastening the girdle, so that had to be taken off. Not having that on allows water to get everywhere, which is a bit messy. I set the platform here at just past touching. Is going to need to grind in a little ways to change the round to the more squared outline. I grind in until it hits the stop, which wasn't quite in far enough, so I lower the platform just a little and grind to the stop again, repeating until the girdle and depth left of the crown looks a little more proportional for the stone before cutting in the other girdle facets in the tier at the same setting. I am satisfied with the rough in, so I switch to the 800 grit lap for the main cutting. I save the height that I used for those girdle facets and then adjust back to the original height for the 41 degree facets, but bring the height down just a hair to get past the hard stop and recreate the center point with the 800 grit by grinding back to the hard stop with 4 facets and checking them. Once they create a good center point, I facet the rest of the facets again that meet at the center point. This is how the stone is looking with those facets ground in. The girdle still needs to come in a bit to have adequate room for the crown. I adjust back down for doing them next. I lower the platform a little more and cut in the girdle to the stop, adjusting until it looks about adequate, and then go around and facet the other 3 girdles in the set to the stop as well. I check the size. It is close to 9.2 millimeters, but that would still work in a standard 9 millimeter setting, so I leave it where it is. I adjust for cutting the smaller corner girdle facets. I lower the platform until the edges are just touching. These facets I place visually by cutting a little and looking until these facets line up parallel with the other set of girdle facets. I am not likely to get the platform height set perfectly to where the meets for these facets would line up with the stop. So if I tried going all the way to the hard stop, these facets would have cut in too far. The hard stop works for the first set of facets for the center point and the 1 set of girdle facets. After that, everything with this cut is meet point based and is cut in more visually than based off the stop. Though the facets should be set to where they are still cutting pretty close to the stop, which is also the intended angle for the facets. So adjusting to where the stone is barely touching at the correct angle and visually checking the facets as they cut in, I add the facets for the remaining 2 tiers of facets for the pavilion of this stone. Here it is, all ground in at the 800 grit level. From here, I switch out to the provided 1200 grit. This is the last of the 3 laps that are provided before going to polish. From the provided resources that I received to go off of, they flip the zinc alloy lap with the cutting lap still with it over and use the bottom of the zinc lap for polishing. Keeping the cutting lap with it maintains the same height for adjusting to go back over the facets. Though this 1200 grit lap is new and is cutting too sharp for me to consider trying to polish directly from it. So instead of only using one side of the zinc alloy lap for polish, I decide to use one side with 3000 diamond for pre-polish before flipping it and using the other side for polishing with a 60,000 diamond grit. I prep the new zinc polishing lap based on what they did in the examples. Using a piece of sandpaper, I used 400 grit. I scratched the lap, creating lines that run inner to outer on the lap, going around until the whole lap has been scuffed this way. These scratches are areas that will help catch the diamond grit and assist in embedding the grit into the surface of the lap. After using the sandpaper, I wash off the surface of the lap before continuing. I add several decent sized drops of oil and spread that out evenly across the surface. Then I rub a good amount of 3000 diamond paste onto the lap. You can mix diamond powder with oil, make a slurry to do this. I like the paste. I use a bit here for the first charge to rub around and work into the lap. I made my own pressure tool for this by shaping and polishing a bowl of sapphire rough. Using some pressure, I go around rubbing the diamond into the lap. After going around a few times, I turn on the machine and run it with the tool on the lap to further try and set the diamond as much as possible. The lap should now be sufficiently charged, so I apply a little more oil to clean and re-lubricate it, as well as add just a little more 3K paste to the surface to boost the charge. I didn't want to place one of the cutting laps under the other side of the zinc lap, as I will be using that side for polish. Since the cutting wheel height is different, all the presets I had saved are all a little off now, so I just set the mask to where the stone barely touches with each set of facets. I start with the girdle and work my way back through the stone. A couple of times I had to tweak the platform height a tiny bit because the pre-polish wasn't taking to the whole facet face evenly, but setting the platform to just barely touching was usually pretty close. Where the handpiece isn't attached to the mast, it is really easy to take off the handpiece and adjust it for easily looking at the facet that is being worked on. At the same time, you got to be careful to not drop a foot of the handpiece off the edge of the platform, as that is easy to do. I almost did that a couple times, but it didn't take very long to get a good feel for how much I can move the handpiece on the platform. Here's the stone ground in with the 3000 diamond paste, which is much better as a pre-polish than what I got with that new 1200 grit lap. I marked the lap to indicate that this side is charged with 3K diamond before flipping to use the other side. I don't want to get confused as to which side was used with which grit later on. Just like I did on the other side of the lap to prep and set the 3K diamond, I do the same procedure to this side for setting 60K diamond paste. I go back over all of the facets one more time for polish. There is no variable speed control, and I like to polish at a slower speed, so I just throttle the foot controller, pressing and letting off, not allowing it to build up to full speed. Once the polish is finished, I can take the dop out of the quill. So far the stone is looking really good. Now, since all the dots are the same, I have to be able to transfer the pavilion of the stone to be held by a flat dop. To make this work, I form the wax to stick out a ways past the end of the dop stick so that when I press the stone into it, it will form a cone around the pavilion of the stone with the wax to hold it. Trying to use heat to soften the wax on the original dop for removing caused the stone to shift quite a bit, so after getting the original dop off, I had to recenter the stone and use the work table to correct the tilt by pressing the flat part of the stone against the workpiece. I used the other work table set up next to the lap to check how well the stone was centered and made any corrections until it was close enough to continue. I don't normally work with wax, so this took me at least 15 minutes to get it done well enough to move on. I am now only going to use a zinc lap for pre-polish and polish since I am using both sides of it. So I place on a separate master lap that I bought because I thought I might need it. It is a bit thinner than the zinc lap, even with the topper lap on it. I place a girdle facet flat on the edge of the lap while on the correct index for it before tightening the quill. This should get the rotation alignment close. I can then adjust for fastening the first tier of crown facets, start the water drip, and get to grinding. I skipped 400 and started with the 800 grit lap. The first facet I am grinding in just a little and checking to see if I can visually notice if the rotation is off. It is. This silver piece is the cheater knob for the rotation alignment. To adjust that, I first slightly loosen this twist knob in front of it to allow me to twist it. The silver piece needs to be rotated in the same direction as the stone needs to be rotated for the correction. In this case, it is just a little counterclockwise. The twist knob is then tightened to keep it held in place. I then go back and grind the facet in just a little bit more, checking again and continuing to make any corrective adjustments necessary until the facet is cutting evenly level with its matching girdle facet. There are marks on the mast that help to see how far is being adjusted. I grind in the first facets until the girdle thickness is within an area that I like it, and then add the remaining facets for the crown based off their sequential meet points until they are all ground in. I can go from 800 grit to 3000, so I don't go over it again with the 1200 lap as there is no need. So I go over the crown facets again with the pre-polish, and then flip the lap over, and I go back over everything again with the polish. The last facet to be done is the table facet. The 45-degree angle adapter is used for this. It is used while the angle of the faceting hand is set to 45 degrees. I adjust the platform and got it set to where the adapter sits evenly flat on the lap before tightening it into the quill. The dop with the stone is placed up into the adapter and locked in with a screw on the outside. I can then adjust the platform down to barely touching to facet the table. I bring in the table facet close to its meets, leaving just a tiny bit of material to be removed with the pre-polish before finishing it up with the polish. Here the table facet is polished in and the stone is done. The ruby is dopped with wax, so just a little heat will soften the wax, allowing the stone to be removed from the dop. After making sure the stone is cool, I dip it in acetone to clean off any wax still on the surface of the stone, and I can take a look at it. The ruby looks pretty good. It isn't perfectly precise, but still pretty great overall. Next, I will be demonstrating how to use this octagonal handpiece. It is basically a quill and index gear having 8 flat faces on the outside of the plastic piece. There are 8 sets of notches along the inside of the plastic piece that the quill can be set to. The quill is pulled out and rotated to adjust between the notches. The 8 outer faces of the wheel are numbered for easy reference while faceting. The inner ones are also numbered. The total number of combinations that can be made with the Octagon handpiece is just like using a 64 index. I picked out one of my fairly flawed pieces of grossular garnets to use during this demonstration. This is my first time using the handpiece, and I will be trying to facet a round brilliant in this stone using the crown first method. I haven't cut a stone that way, so we'll see how this goes. I prepared this stone by grinding in a flat for the table and gave it a slight preform. I was getting things ready for dopping the stone, but I really don't like how I have to have the splash guard completely off for doing anything at 90 degrees, mostly when faceting and it gets water everywhere. So I decided to modify the splash guard. I marked and cut out an opening to where it wouldn't get in the way. Having the opening that low would allow the water to escape when doing any cutting, so I cut out a piece of plastic from a cheap table placemat and folded it so that it would cover the slot for when I don't need the slot open and keep the water from escaping. I use heat to manipulate the plastic and get it to form to the curvature of the splash guard until it fit very well, hardly poking out on either side. The piece is very easy to remove and slide back on. It doesn't come close to coming in contact with the lap at all, so pretty good. Okay, back to the demonstration. I used the wax that was still on one of the dop sticks from the first stone to dop this garnet. I attached what will be the pavilion of the stone. This method actually starts with the girdle, which I attempt to round in by hand using one of the dopping work tables to try and hold the dop level and steady. I didn't do a great job at this. I took off a little more material than I meant to, and the stone is still a little lopsided. I could have done a better job if I used the other handpiece set at 90 degrees to round it in, but I wanted to try doing the stone as if I only had the Octagon hand and other provided materials. I hit the girdle lightly with the 3000 grit so that it would look slightly polished. After the girdle is done, the table facet is actually the first facet that will be faceted. This is almost exactly opposite to the cutting style that I do, so I start by attaching the 45-degree angle adapter. I just adjust the platform until the adapter sits evenly on the lap while in the quill and tighten it. I use the pliers to tighten the lock a little past hand tight. The Octagon handpiece has no form of angle indicator, so I bought a digital angle reader so that I could find the angle using this handpiece. Setting that on the quill, I could find what the angle is at. The way the angles are referenced on the faceting diagram isn't the same way that the angle finder reads while set on the quill. Basically, the 0 and 90 degree reference for a faceting diagram and the angle reader are opposite. Since 45 is right in the middle though, setting the angle to 45 is still the correct angle. I am not trying to take off very much material here. I think the table would look fine where it is at, so I am grinding in just enough to work through the grit sequences for cutting and polish. I started with the 800 lap and then moved on to pre-polish and polish. The facet is the entire width of the stone. I maybe could have preformed a slight angle coming in from the outer edge of the stone if I wanted to not do the full area for the table, as about half of that will get cut away. The rotation doesn't matter for putting the dop into the quill, as all there is a rounded girdle and the table facet. There is nothing that needs to be lined up. The angle on the diagram reads to set the angle to 35 degrees, but the reader when set on top is opposite. So if I subtract 35 from 90, that leaves 55, which is what the angle reader should read for the grinding angle to be 35. I made notes on my diagram for what the reader should be, as well as what notch is used on the octagon hand for each set of facets on the diagram. The first set of facets will be done with the inner notch set to 1. This set is the 8 main facets. I have no reference and no stops for keeping the facets even, so I keep the facets relatively even by grinding each facet using the same pressure for the same amount of time, doing all 8 facets in order. I just do one quick swipe for each and then check. It looked like they needed to be a little larger, so I went around one more time, lightly grinding the facets more. Looking at the table's ratio to width, this may have been pushing it though, as I still have to add the star facets, which are next when faceting this way. The angle that I am using for these facets is 18, so I set the angle reader to read 72 degrees. The 8 star facets are done using notch number 2 on the inner wheel. These facets are very small, so I try to use a quick light touch to do them, going around the wheel once. And that was too much. The facets were supposed to be very small, with the table meeting at the points. I would have done better using a finer grit like the 3K for pre-polish, as that wouldn't cut as fast, making it easier to not overcut. I could change the angle of the mains to meet back up and have a small table, but I don't want the table that small, so I will just recut the table after doing the rest of the crown the way I normally do. There are 16 break facets, so I will use notches both 3 and 4 to cut them. I start with notch 3 and set the angle reader to 49 to cut the facets at 41 degrees. These facets are also fairly small, so I will try and be a little more careful with them. These facets also have a meet I can go off of, being the bottom point of the star facets. After figuring out about how long to grind for one facet, I do the rest the same. This is how it looks after just doing the notch 3 facets. I still have the other half of the tier to go. All I need to do is switch to notch 4 and I can do the remaining 8 facets. I go around once quickly and touch up any facets that need to go further. That finishes out that tier and the crown facets on the 800 lap. I have saved my mast heights using the lock tabs, but the polish lap is thicker than the cutting setup. I can compensate for the difference by adding enough of the topper laps to the platform to make up the difference. I am already set for the break facets, so I start there to work back through the pre-polish. After polishing one facet in a tier, I use the same amount of sweeps and pressure for the remaining facets in that tier. Here it is with the pre-polish finished. I then work forward again from where it is set for polishing, using the same number of topper laps used at the saved platform heights. I don't show it, but I also go back and redo the table facet after finishing the polish of the crown facets. Here the crown is all polished up. Certainly not my best work, but it's okay. It at least has a nice polish. I took the stone off the original dot before trying to attach it again for faceting the pavilion. I pressed the table of the stone firmly to the flat of the dot to try and get it to sit flat on the dot. I then spend about 15 minutes or so again working it to get it close enough for my liking to centered. So I skipped showing most of that. I'm not highly experienced in wax stopping like this to be very fast at it. The rotation doesn't have to be perfect for the pavilion in relationship to the crown on stones with rounded girdles, as the pavilion will cut the same however it is rotated. But I still try to get it close to the correct orientation for the overall look of the stone. I start with the break facets of the pavilion, which use the same indices as the break facets of the crown. That is notches 3 and 4 on the Octagon handpiece. The angle for these facets is 45, so I adjust the mast until the angle on the reader is also close to 45 degrees. I start grinding these facets, grinding in one to establish a girdle thickness, and grinding in the next few until the girdle thickness between them looks relatively the same thickness. After doing a few facets, a center point begins to form, and I can grind in the rest of the facets for the set based on that as well to keep them even, and touch up any facets needed to make that point clean. Cleaning up the point pushes any errors out to the girdle, which will be slightly uneven with the stone being not perfectly round. The angle for the second set of pavilion facets is 43, so I set the reader to about 47 degrees. These facets are done using notch number 1. These facets are cut to meet the girdle, and I focus on keeping the center point meeting nicely with this tier as well. Since it is more difficult having to use the digital angle reader and a bit of guessing when adjusting for different facet tiers, I think the simpler the cut, the better for using the Octagon handpiece, though it can technically be used for any 64 index pattern. Having finished the pre-polish, I just got to run back through polish. I definitely had a better feel for holding this handpiece by the end of it. It probably doesn't help that I am left-handed, but using the right-handed tools usually isn't too much of an issue for me. And it is finished. So I'll get it out of the quill, heat it off the dop, and get it cleaned up. At this point, the demonstrations are finished. Hopefully I've given enough information in this video that you would be able to use the FABLE Faceting machine and both of the hand pieces in either of the faceting styles I used, doing the pavilion first or the other way, doing the crown first. Personally, I'll keep faceting the way I have, which is the pavilion first. Let me know in the comments which way you prefer to facet if you're a faceter, or which way you think you would like to if you got into faceting. The grossular garnet isn't too bad, it's just a little wonky, but the lab ruby is really pretty. It turned out amazing. Anyway, that is how I faceted gemstones using the hand pieces and faceting machine from FABLE. I've only used one other machine before this, so it was a good learning experience for me. Thanks for joining me for it. I'll be back soon.